few more seconds. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Andrea Polanco, a research scientist at Faunalytics, and today I am joined by Dr. Ahmmad Brown, and both of us will discuss a collaboration that we worked on. And our report is titled Navigating Equity and Inclusion Across High Diverse Animal Advocacy Movements. So before we get started, I'll introduce myself. Ahmed will introduce himself, then we're just going to give a quick overview of what we did in the study, what we found, our recommendations, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So I'm Andrea. Nice to meet everyone. I'm a researcher at Faunalytics. My background is actually in animal welfare science, but I switched to social sciences when I joined Faunalytics. Super happy to be doing that. I also have experience doing animal advocacy through different grassroots organizations. So yeah, happy to be here.
Perfect. Thank you, Andrea. It's a pleasure to be here as well. My name is Ahmmad Brown. I was the principal investigator on the qualitative side of the report. I have a couple of affiliations. I operate at the scholar-practitioner intersection. I'm on the practitioner side, I'm a principal advisor with the firm Working Ideal. On the scholarly side, I just switched affiliations. I was formerly at Northwestern School of Ed and Social Policy. I'm now at the Tufts University College of Civic Life. So broadly speaking, I'm an organizational sociologist and I study inequality in organizations. Very appropriate, of course, for our paper in this conversation today. Again, a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So yeah, quick overview on what we did. So the report is based on mixed methods. So that means that we combine desk research with semi-structured interviews to understand both the movement's level landscape and lived experiences. So it's important to note that we conducted this research prior to the 2025 US political changes that, as we all know, has affected DEI programs, especially around universities and organizations around the country. So just keeping that in mind. So I'll explain a little bit about the desk research. So for this, we reviewed over 200 US farm animal advocacy organizations' websites. And what we did is we wanted to see basically whether or not these organizations made any mention of DEI or social justice in their mission, their programs, and their workplace policies. So it was a simple yes or no, do they talk about these things based on public information on their websites. And we use standard definitions of DEI and social justice, which you can look at in the report. So that was the desk research portion. For the interviews, we in total interviewed 22 people. So we first interviewed 9 BIPOC animal advocates, and then we interviewed 5 BIPOC non-animal advocates. So for these two groups, we just really wanted to know for those who were in the movements, like what were their motivations for joining? What were their perceptions of the movement? Have they ever felt excluded? If so, what happened? And for the non-advocates, non-animal advocate group, we just wanted, really curious about, like, have you heard of the animal protection movement? Like, what were your experiences when you like learned about the movement? Did you ever want to join? Why or why not? And for both groups, like when there were issues of exclusion or inclusion, we basically also asked them if you can tell organizations what they can improve on, like what would you tell them? So then our last group that we interviewed were 8 organization leaders of these US farmed groups. So typically they were executive directors or they were directors of operations. And we also asked them about perceptions of the movements. But in addition, we showed them the participant-led recommendations that were given to us in the previous two groups. So we basically showed them recommendations that revolved around external communication, internal communication, as well as community outreach. And we basically just wanted to know what their reactions were. Like, for example, we asked them, is this realistic to implement at your organization? Why or why not? Is there any hesitation? So in the end, like I said, it was 22 interviews. As with all qualitative research, it tends to be like a more of a narrow sample size. But again, it's still very useful to do this type of research qualitatively because we can't really get these answers through, for example, a survey, a closed-ended questions. Like there's a lot of nuance when it comes to these topics. So qualitative research allows for that like rich in-depth analysis. So yeah, now Dr. Brown will go over some key findings.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to give some context for this, I'm going to offer these findings and really the theoretical and conceptual framing as a way for us to think about, again, how we approach the creation of the study itself, but also, as Andrea was just saying, how we approach the analysis of the data, this very rich, long interview transcripts, putting them into what we think of as conversation, right, with what we know about how organizations work, what we know about how movements work from the literature, both scholarly and practitioner. So I'm going to offer really five key points here, and then Andrea is going to make them a bit more grounded, a bit more tangible for folks in terms of what that actually means for me and my organization as a leader, a member, in very practical terms. But again, the five key things. The first one is that identity is really central to this report, right? Not just individual identity, but organizational identity, which you see kind of front and center in the introduction of the report and framing. And fundamentally, our point is this. Any organizational action, inclusive of DEI, and especially actually DEI, will generally be more successful to the extent that that action is aligned or congruent with the organization's identity. All right. So, what that means when we say organizational identity, it's kind of like a personal identity, but at the organizational level, it's who you are, what you say you are, how you do what you say it is that you're doing. Right. And the key point there again is self-awareness of organizational identity is really important. Honest self-assessment and self-awareness of who you are as an organization, who you are, what you do, how you do it is really important. And that's the foundation, in my field, that's the foundation for, a lot of how we think about organizations. But certainly as it pertains to diversity, equity, and inclusion work. The second point is around this organizational and social justice framing that we also use to set up our findings and recommendations. So drawing on the organizational justice framing, I want to make something very clear. By no means, if you take the organizational justice framing, it does not mean that you don't look at things like demographic identity markers like race or gender or like status or power. You very much do. Right. But what we're saying and how we think about the org justice framing, the organizational justice framing relative to a social justice framing is that you're orienting and deliberately focusing your DEI efforts explicitly in the confines of your walls, right? Your literal or metaphorical walls of your organization. You're very much taking into account issues of societal inequality along race, gender, sexual orientation, whatever, ethnicity, religion, whatever, in your particular context. You're very much considering how those things at the societal level influence you in your organization. But you're very deliberately and intentionally thinking about what to do about those realities firmly in the confines of your walls, right? Again, literal and metaphorical. And fundamentally, what we believe that does, and I've seen this in practice, and there's evidence of this to a degree in the literature, is that it unburdens organizations from overextending or being performative in their work, right? And that's true for any type of action. It doesn't just have to be DEI, but it just so happens to be, for perhaps obvious reasons, that when it comes to DEI, it's very too easy to overextend and be performative, irrespective of intentionality, right? It's just sometimes you can make promises, say you're doing things to an extent that you're actually not over the long term capable of fulfilling. So related to that point three, the organizational and social justice framings are not binary or mutually exclusive, right? One way to think about those framings is you can, as we say several times in the paper, organizational justice. If you're saying you're doing DEI, it's a bare minimum. It's like think of it as almost like the first step of a ladder or a stairway. And the extent to which you layer, or an organization layers social justice oriented approaches, which more intentionally look at in using DEI efforts to change, to move the outside world beyond your walls. You can layer that on the organizational justice, but not having that organizational justice orientation, meaning fairness in processes, procedures, distributive justice, as it's called, meaning people get what they deserve in terms of rewards, monetary and otherwise. Without that foundation, it becomes very difficult for organizations to engage in more explicit social justice efforts around DEI if their so-called house isn't in order, right? If you're not already doing what you should be doing around justice terms internally within your organization. The fourth thing is that, like personal identities, some elements of organizational identity will never change. Some can and will change, right? So when you're doing that honest self-assessment, self-awareness of who we are, how we do it as an organization, know that that's not set in stone. That's not static. Even without your agency, you have to react to external environments. You will change, right? We don't, as individuals and as organizations, we don't live in vacuums. Right. So where you are today, perhaps, as you're thinking about, like, what is our org identity? Know that next week, or probably not next week, but next year, 5 years, 10 years down the line, that not only can, but it likely will change. So again, the key is kind of continuous, self-awareness, self-assessment at the organizational level. And then lastly, point five, and this is sort of embedded in the report. We didn't actually uplift it too much in the abstract or, and I guess the marketing materials. But I wanted to uplift this distinction between professionalization as culture and structure, right? And so it's part of the report. You'll see it if you kind of read the longer form version of it. But professionalization is a fraught word, particularly in professionalism in the context of diversity, equity, and inclusion work, particularly around inclusion. And the idea here is that when we talk about professionalizing or professionalism in cultural terms like, dress, style of talk, things of that nature, that gets into places where we're really getting into inequality that can manifest very perniciously. Like, if you have a certain type of hairstyle or if you present a certain way, like you end up, not getting hired for a job. Like all those things that many of us, probably all of us in this room are to some degree aware of, right? That is distinct from when we talk about professionalizing and professionalization in terms of structure, right? Having formal HR or people operations mechanisms, processes, having clear feedback mechanisms, trainings for managers. And one of the things that showed up in our data, not just amongst leaders, but also amongst our some of the current advocates in the movement, was this, some of them mentioned a certain reticence they noticed in their organizations to having more professional structure, right? Because there's this tension in identity. It's like, well, maybe we started in this organization as explicitly a movement, but now we have all kinds of large philanthropic funding and we've grown. We have lots of people and people from different backgrounds, and we're lacking in HR or people operation structures, which in turn downstream can actually lead to, exacerbated, right, inequality. Because if, for example, if you're a person of color or a woman, right, in a U.S. context in particular, and you don't feel like there's an upward feedback mechanism, and there's no way or no formal way for you to know where to go if you're struggling, right? You can kind of imagine and see in real time, as some of you may already know, like how that can yield to really bad outcomes for folks with marginalized identities or multiple of them. So those are kind of five key conceptual points, like kind of the framing. And I want to hand it back to Andrea to talk about what that actually means in terms of what organizations and leaders can do.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. So for our recommendations in the report, they're divided into three groups for organizations and leaders, for funders, and then lastly for BIPOC advocates. So I'll start with that order. So for organizations and leaders, it's kind of going back to what Dr. Brown was saying about organization identity. So it's really important that organizations sit down amongst each other, staff, and ask themselves, like, who are we in terms of our values? And then you anchor your DEI strategy based on your values, mission, and strategy. So nowhere in our report do we say like, oh, organizations should change their mission to say XYZ. Like DEI efforts really need to be genuine, and that all goes back to like what the organization, how they identify themselves. And secondly, going back to the ladder metaphor Dr. Brown was using, yeah, definitely like the recommendations we have, it's scaled, right? So small organizations will have different expectations from organizations. So we do expect larger organizations to have greater capacity and accountability to model organizational justice, whereas like smaller organizations can focus on things like inclusive communication, transparent policies, which we view as like a baseline, and then you kind of like move up from there. And then we also have a set of organizations that are divided by mission type. So this would be like whether your organization is solely focused on animal rights, if it also includes health and environment aspects, or if they actually do identify as a social justice organization. So these different missions reflect different stakeholder communities and therefore will have different equity considerations. So, for example, the more committed an organization is to social justice, the more likely the staff, volunteers, and its audience will expect that organization to address different injustices for reasons that are independent of like animal welfare or animal suffering. So, just to give you an example of what that would look like, if there's an organization just based on animal rights, then we expect them to focus on just learning about foundational topics related to DEI. So this could look like learning about animal agriculture's disproportionate harms to marginalized communities, just as an example. If an organization is also like health focused or environment focused, then we would expect some type of community engagement strategy. So does this organization partner with BIPOC and environmental groups to co-host community events? That's just an example. And then lastly, for social justice organizations, here is where we would expect that this organization is working for full structural accountability in terms of like how they disclose whether or not how DEI practices shape their programs and things like that. So, like I said, let's our recommendations really shouldn't be viewed as a checklist, but it's really tailored to the type of organization that you work for. And then for funders, I'm not sure if there are funders in the audience, but we do have some recommendations if you are. So it's kind of similar to the organization one in terms of taking a step back and asking yourself some tough questions. Like if you say you care about equity, then how are you showing that through your funding practices, right? So are you supporting underfunded groups? Like, are you investing in BIPOC centered spaces? And then we also recommend that funders give money or funding so that grantees can actually audit their workplace policies and see how they can improve in terms of DEI there, as an example. And then for BIPOC advocates in our audience, we also have just a set of recommendations in terms of it's really up to you whether or not you want to engage in these conversations. Being aware that burnout is a thing that can happen in terms of invisible labor. So setting boundaries. What does compensation look like for you? It's something to think about. So setting limits on that. And again, saying no, like if you don't want to help an organization improve their DEI policy, that's totally valid. So just always remembering that in the end, it's your decision. And then also recommend seeking out spaces for BIPOC advocates. So in the US, the most well-known ones are Apex Advocacy. There's Afro Vegan Society. There's Food Empowerment Project that has different like cultural cuisine recipe books. So there are spaces in the movement that you can seek out that are just for like BIPOC animal advocates. And then lastly, like if you, again, this is up to you, if you want to be vocal about things that you're passionate about is like basically using your platform in terms of like social media or applying to speak at conferences to talk about your form of advocacy and how you connect it to social justice. Is that something that you do? But yeah, so those are basically the gist of the findings and the recommendations. Please do check out the full report. And yeah, we can take questions now. Thank you. There is a question at the moment, but
No questions. I did notice when just there's where did it go? The Linda, yeah, it's always good to see other sociologists and yes, qualitative research. I'm a big proponent of qualitative research for a lot of reasons. Always happy to connect with other sociologists doing qualitative work. It's very important for getting the specificity, right, in terms of what I care about, putting research into practice. So yeah, thanks for that, Linda.
Well, I might have a question for you, Ahmed, just because it's maybe get a conversation going. Oh, wait, no, there's a conversation in the audience.
Mhm.
So sorry, Linda asked, did you find most advocates already committed to social justice already? I hope so. They're one in the same.
I'm pausing and I'm curious, Andrea, what you have to say, and I'll offer a brief
Yes.
answer, and then I'm curious what you have to say. I Part of why I'm pausing is I'm trying to unpack in my head, because Linda, I know what you mean by committed, and thinking back to our interviews and the data from the interviews, I think both the leaders and the advocates and prospective advocates would complicate what they mean by what might be meant by committed. So I'll leave that hanging, and then I'll hand it to Andrea, and then I'm curious what Andrea has to say, and then I'll offer a bit more myself.
Yeah, based on our interviews, which again, not necessarily generalizable to the entire movements, but at least with the BIPOC animal advocate group that we interviewed, I would say most of them were for sure committed to social justice and that they always brought it back to a broader issue, like not just farmed animals. Like in a lot of those interviews, like there were connections made to injustices of like again environmental harms to marginalized communities or like the workers themselves in the animal agriculture industry or just like cultural nuances when it comes to plant-based eating like so there were connections brought back to not just animals that were mentioned so yeah I guess I would go back to and then I think for leaders it was a little bit more divided in terms of whether or not animal advocacy should or should not be part of this like more holistic conversation about social justice. I would say there was maybe a little more different perspectives on that from a leadership angle. But I would say for the ones who identified as like just the animal advocate, there was, I think, a consensus that it was like connected to social justice.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's how I engage the data. And we obviously Andrea had plenty
Mm-hmm.
of conversations about this, but fundamentally it's I think for leaders in particular, they were the ones I would find who might complicate that notion of committed. In that obviously we want to start from a place of values, which is embedded in that org identity question or push. And there's fundamentally leaders would talk a lot about, and this is, you can see this in, particularly, I think that the appendix, there's a lot of data around leaders sort of wondering, I may have these values and I'm operating in an environment where I'm beholden to, my funders, and pick an issue, broadly speaking, social justice issue, figuring out how to walk the lines, of, financial and operational realities. Right. So this is also why, just to kind of anchor back to some of the earlier conversations, and Andrea's points around like no one size fits all essentially approach here, a recommendation from us. Um, there's leaders, at least in our sample, were grappling with all of this, deeply, right? And as you get larger, you get greater scale, you potentially and ideally have greater impact, one way to think of it, but it also then means you have greater obligations to multiple other actors, right? Who may have a different idea of what committed to social justice or liberation of animals or non-human animals, et cetera, might mean. Right. And on the flip side, some of the smaller organizations who may not yet have those resources, some of those leaders thinking very critically about, yeah, like really, truly, with specificity, what does my commitment to social justice look like in the context of this current moment of socio-political contestation around diversity, equity, and inclusion work? Um, and also, I have people and I need to pay them. All right. So so I would say yes, like on a very baseline level, yeah, social justice, like everyone we talk to is committed to it. I mean, I don't think you're in the space unless you are committed to it. And particularly for the leaders, I was really impressed, honestly, with the level of reflection and introspection in terms of, okay, I have this commitment, and there are also operational realities which are especially acute once you enter that more formalized, mainstream, well-funded space.
Vivian has a question. How can organizations redefine traditional standards of professionalism?
Yeah, I love that question. I'm going to give a somewhat flippant answer first, and I'll elaborate. Just be more inclusive, right? And like that's a intentionally flippant answer, right? In that, and to unpack it, what I mean by that is, and this is sort of the way I think a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion work has been perceived and treated, particularly in popular mainstream media. You think of like trainings and workshops, like, you know, there's a big conversation to be had about the efficacy and the value of trainings and workshops, like one-offs. But one of the things that I think is present in all of them are things like unconscious bias and, just on a conceptual level, yeah, what comes into your head subconsciously or unconsciously, if you see, a person in dreads, a black male in dreadlocks or a woman, with dreadlocks or, dresses or with tattoos, whatever. Like, all these things and sort of this goes back to that self-awareness and self-assessment piece. Like if you're truly as an organization interested in expanding, what in your context is meant by professional, because, professional means something very different in every single context, right? Um, Getting very clear and specific about what professionalism means there, and if you even want to invoke that term or the notion of professionalism, right, in a cultural sense. And being very clear and specific, making the implicit explicit is something I often talk about in this kind of work. That's, I think, the big piece. And then actually, living up to those stated, expectations and values in your day to day and consistently, reinforcing it through a variety of cultural mechanisms. But aside from my very flippant, like just do it, like there's a part of just doing it where it's like you have to be specific and clear, right? Like you have like it's a lot of this is being very clear about what it is you're expecting of people, and again, it also goes back to that identity piece.
Well, thank you so much for that. And we have another question by Ivan. Many organizations in the animal advocacy and effective altruism space define their impact quantitatively, for example, cost effectiveness, such as dollars per life saved or reduced animal suffering. How can DEI initiatives within these organizations
Mhm.
be translated into metrics that align with this type of framework?
I love this question, and I'm sad we have less than a minute at this point. And I'm happy to connect with folks offline, particularly Yvonne Ivan. Pardon me if I'm mispronouncing your name. Happy to connect offline. But the quick answer is for me, there are it is too much of a burden and for very real evidence-based and theoretical reasons to expect DEI initiatives to drive what we might call like bottom line metrics. So like when I work with for-profit organizations, even not for profit, frankly, like it's, revenue, net profit, all of that. That is the intervention and the work has to be at a similar scale to match that level of outcome. What I promote and what I really advise organizations to do is get very clear about what I refer to as intermediate outcomes that are then translated to and extend to those higher level broad organizational performance outcomes like revenue or profit, net profit, whatever. So what I mean by an intermediate outcome is if your inclusion work, for example, is about team engagement, then you need to obviously measure team engagement in one or more ways, right? And then, the first order is to create like a logic chain or a model for then how does team engagement very tangibly and quantitatively translate to a large bottom line organizational outcome. And that specific logic chain is going to look different in every context, but that's part of the work, right? That's the work, right? And but I think part of it again is unburdening, right? Any kind of DEI type efforts with like because it's like this catch 22. We always want to like there's a business case for DEI, but it's like yeah, and anti-bias training is not going to translate to bottom line. It's just not like for reasons I could get into later, right? Offline, but really emphasizing the intermediate outcomes and like having a clear in your context logic chain for how these intermediate outcomes inform and drive organizational outcomes.
Yeah, I love just want to quickly add on the business case for DEI. So when I first read this question, I was like, oh, like, yeah, because there are some people who maybe think about DEI in terms of um, just strategy when really the flip the criticism of that is just like you're being extractive, right? Like, oh,
Mhm.
maybe you don't actually care about these marginalized communities because in the end, like you're just relating it. You only care because it relates back to farm animal suffering or so. Yeah, when you brought up the business case for DEI, I was just like, that's what I was thinking of. But
Mhm.
that was a great question.
Absolutely.
So yeah, if people follow-up question by Ivan. Maybe it helps with retention and that has a financial outcome, cost of
Yeah,
hiring, training.
it does. And just really quick, it helps. It could be not anything, but for example, it's when I work with I work with organizations across sectors. Like when I work with say like Silicon Valley type startups, like small startups. The big thing they're interested in is innovation, and you can unpack innovation in a whole bunch of different ways, right? But yeah, like sure, like baseline things like retention, we all know turnover costs a lot of money, but there's a lot of evidence, and it's very theoretically sound to say, yeah, if you unpack and unlock inclusion, you're going to be more innovative. And innovation can mean again, it will mean different things in different contexts, but then it's no longer kind of a DEI question. Then it's more of like an org design and an org strategy question of, okay, so we want to be innovative. How are we being innovative at the unit or team level? Downstream from that, how are we assessing? How are we making sure that we have the structures, processes, accountability mechanisms to make sure people are innovating and managers are supporting the innovation if you're hierarchical in that way, right? So like there's it's retention, sure, like that's kind of like the lowest common denominator one, but for spaces that rely on creativity, new ideas, looking for new opportunities, new ways to, in this context, prevent animal suffering, like yeah, that's the case for it. And that's like, it's not really a business case because the business case means, usually like profit or revenue. It's like that's all downstream. It's more of like an operational case and like an organizationally aligned operational case is like more of a scholarly and convoluted way of putting it. But that's the work. And that's why, I find DEI work to still be incredibly interesting and necessary because here's the thing, whether you name it or not, all organizations are diverse. It's just a matter of whether or not you're naming or acknowledging that diversity.
Right. I think we are at time. I don't see more questions. But yeah, thank you, Dr. Brown, for joining me today. If you want to put your email in the chat, up to you, in case people want to follow up with anything that you had to say. And yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for your questions and for joining us. It was a pleasure. And thanks again, everyone.
Absolutely. Take care, everyone. A
Yeah,
pleasure being here.
thanks.